There's a lot of interest in how the super major oil and gas companies are transitioning to a low carbon future. And BloombergNEF recently released a climate score, scoring 39 of them on their sustainability and their emissions and so on. So we're going to talk to Jonas Rooze, who put the data together. Welcome to the interview, Jonas.
Hi, Markham. Pleasure to be here.
Why don't we start with an overview of your climate scores, if we can?
Yeah, absolutely. So the climate scores are composed of two parts, one of which that we worked on at BloombergNEF and another component that was worked on by our colleagues at Bloomberg Intelligence. And those two parts are around emissions, which is the part worked on by Bloomberg Intelligence, and around the business model. And then each of those break down into two further parts, which are, sort of here and now component. So in terms of emissions, that's the emissions today and the recent trend in emissions reduction for these companies. And in terms of business model, that is the current fossil fuel business for these oil companies and how exposed to transition those fossil fuel businesses are. And then there's a future component. So on the carbon side, that's the carbon targets that these companies have set and how those compare. And on the business model side, that's how is this company adapting its business model or not, as the case may be, for transition to a low carbon economy. The overall purpose of these scores is answering the question, how prepared is this company for a low carbon world?
That's very interesting. And in your list on the top 10, no surprise, many of the European majors like BP and Shell and Equinor are there. But sitting in number 10 position is Suncor, the Canada's largest oil and gas company that's very, very heavily invested in the oil sands. And I was surprised, frankly, to see it there. Could you maybe explain how it managed to make number 10?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Suncor came out quite high in the overall score, and that's the number 10 out of the integrated oil and gas companies, 9 of the biggest oil and gas companies, but that included 8 pure play exploration and production companies and 8 pure play refining companies, and actually some of those did do better than Suncor. So that top 10 is for the integrated companies, and Suncor on the overall score, yes, they ended up with a score of I think 4.5 out of 10, and that broke down into two components. One of them was a relatively lower score on the carbon side of about 3.7, I think, and then a higher score on the business model side of 5.4, and it's really that business model side of it that I think is what drove this this higher performance for Suncor, and it surprised us. And they ended up coming 6th on the sort of overall business model score, and it really has to do with Suncor doing quite a bit more around adapting its business model than maybe a lot of people would have expected. So the way we look at business model adaptation is we look at a number of things. One of them is, is this company expanding its fossil fuel business or not, right? How much is it pumping into its existing fossil fuel business? And then we're looking at the other two sort of really substantial components are what we're calling transition strategies. So this is investment in low carbon technologies. And there's scalable transition strategies on the one hand, which are things like renewables, but also petrochemicals, which are those technologies that have a scalable revenue model associated with them. And then there's early stage transition strategies, which is carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. There's no scalable revenue model today, but these could potentially be an important part of the future for these companies. And Suncor actually, when we looked at the data relative to some of the other companies, they invested less in expanding, particularly their upstream business at that time. Now, all of these companies are still by far and away investing a lot more in their fossil fuel businesses than they do in renewables, right? So it's not, we're not able to make a dollars to dollars comparison because that disclosure is not there. But relative to the other companies, Suncor invested a lot less. And then on the scalable transition strategy side, or actually on the transition strategy side in general, they're doing quite a lot. They've actually got 5 different technologies that they're investing in.
So Jonas, how much of Suncor's score is determined by things it's looking at, considering like hydrogen and more renewables, as opposed to what it actually has a strategy for already and is committed to?
Of their score on the business model side, where they received a score of 5.4, right? I can break that down pretty cleanly. So that breaks down into 1.6 coming from transition strategies. So it's a small component, but it's an important component that comes from the fact that they're investing in all these clean energy technologies. And actually, out of the North American company that we scored, they're probably doing the best on that front. And that was something that surprised us. And actually, this data comes from bottom-up assessment of project level data that BNEF has that we're aggregating. So all of the different wind farms, all of the different EV charging stations, et cetera, we're aggregating that up. And so some of this stuff isn't out there in a publicly disclosed way in this comparable format, and it sort of surprised us. Then they got a substantial component. They got a slightly larger component than that, just from the fact that they aren't expanding their high carbon business as much as others. So that accounts already for probably the largest component of their overall score. And then the final piece where they got a large component, about half again, is because of their positioning in terms of being integrated, but also having a fair amount of refining focus, and so what we basically say is that downstream companies are lower risk than upstream companies, and that being integrated puts you in a better financial position to invest in transition. And Suncor, looks like they're roughly in that sweet spot where they're more downstream in terms of volume, and but they're also integrated, and so they're in a good position from that perspective. We think, fundamentally that means they're in a less risky business. So that's relevant too.
Final question, Jonas. Suncor last summer co-authored an op-ed in which Mark Little, the CEO, talked about how Suncor can invest in some of these technologies, and he singled out the work that's being done by an agency called Alberta Innovates to turn bitumen into carbon fiber. So basically, we're talking about using bitumen as transitioning from bitumen as a feedstock for refining to bitumen as a feedstock for manufacturing and non-combustion purposes. Did that factor in at all into your calculations?
So I think the most relevant area where that would figure is in the petrochemical side of this. So the petrochemicals is a legitimate, we're scoring that as a legitimate sort of low carbon option. Doing on the petrochemical side is we're looking at capacity investment out to 2025, project plans that are announced. So as long as those types of plans are announced and are officially underway, we would have captured them and they would have been included.
Jonas, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.